Chapter 35 Statism as a Religious Fact 1. Fox, in a study of pre-industrial India, noted that the kind of civil government existing then could not be described in terms of the contemporary concept of the state. Quote, Ari Frankenberg has noted that the Western concept of the state is not readily applicable to governmental forms in traditional India. The state in Western political theory enjoys a monopoly of coercive force in the society and is the center of administrative decisions and judicial review. Frankenberg suggests that traditional politics in South Asia never controlled such centralized powers. Rather, administration, police, and civil activities often were dispersed, sometimes resting with the virtually autonomous or independent local overlords, and at other times with kin groups or civil servants. End quote. The same, however, can be said of Europe prior to the French Revolution. In theory, the rulers claimed, quote, divine right, end quote, and absolute power. In practice, their powers were limited, and local units had a variety of independent powers. Although often their taxes did not reach the proportions exacted by the modern state, it can be said of the pre-revolutionary leaders that, on the whole, they taxed more than they ruled. In France, the many religious houses, that is, monasteries with their extensive welfare and educational programs, were suppressed. All sources of charity were seized by the state between 1789 and 1793. Much earlier, the Germanic kingdom not only was not a state, but according to Strayer, quote, was in some ways the complete antithesis of a modern state, end quote. It was based not on the state as an entity, but, quote, on loyalties to persons, not to abstract concepts or impersonal institutions, end quote. In short, quote, security came from family and neighborhood and lord, not from the king, end quote. Even after the origin and development of the state, it was some time, largely since the French Revolution, that drafted and standing armies existed. Taxation was not organized with even the remote thoroughness of the 20th century. The state was essentially the personal court of a king and his associates. The development of the modern states is a religious and anti-Christian fact. Strayer's commitment is especially important. Quote, a state exists chiefly in the hearts and minds of its people if they do not believe it is there. No logical exercise will bring it to life. End quote. It is important to understand this shift from the more basic governments of family, community, and church to the state. The shift was a religious one. Ralph summarized it clearly as it came into intellectual focus in the Renaissance. Quote, together with other thinkers of the age, Erasmus, More, and Machiavelli shared a conviction that, without any change in human nature or any drastic altering of institutions, the political order be made to serve desirable human ends, end quote. As Hellenic thought was revived, the pagan doctrine of the state was reintroduced into European thought. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation set back this paganism for a time, but after 1660 it was again increasingly dominant. With the Enlightenment, it was in obvious power. Mergler said of Western Christianity, quote, after it had struggled, also, but still very thoroughly, at enormous moral, social, and political expense to make man and his world endurable, the Enlightenment suddenly and with great pathos presented it with the claim that the natural man, Rousseau, and even the Jew, Lessing, and the savage, Seme, were better men. In other words, that the 1,000-year-old exertions of Western Christianity had brought about a merely negative result. End quote. In brief, Christianity was increasingly held to be the hindrance to the good life, not the means to it, and the state sought to place a distance between itself and Christianity. Previously, in medieval Europe and the Reformation, Christian man was seen as a necessary unit for a good society. Now he was the impediment. It is ironic that this idea of the secular state is so popular in many evangelical circles because it denies that conversion is necessary before a man and his society can become morally sound. The modern states popularized slogans which had as their purpose the erosion of non-statist government and the enhancement of state power. Max Beloff called attention to this with respect to Austria at the time of the French Revolution. Quote, both liberty and equality were devices by which the state could be strengthened. If Jews and Protestants were to be freed from persecution and encouraged to come into Austria, it might be possible to rival the economic success which toleration was believed to have brought to Prussia. If the serf could be freed and allowed to choose his occupation, industry would acquire new sources of labour. Equality meant the breaking down of the groupings and orders into which the social and legal order was divided, so that all citizens should be equally subordinate to a strengthened bureaucracy and equally tributary to the royal treasury. End quote. Thus, the modern state worked first to free men from church, family, and local rulers and customs in order to strengthen itself at their expense. And then, having accomplished this, it began to strengthen itself against individuals who were now without their traditional coverings and institutions. How radical this destruction of the ancient Christian governments was is apparent when we look at what happened to Benedictine monasteries. Long a source of welfare and more, of almost 1,500 in 1789, only about 30 remained in 1814, and these had fewer men and were despoiled of their assets. The French Revolution had in 1789 proclaimed a Declaration of Rights, but it then proceeded to trample all rights underfoot as no previous regime had ever done. Equality, fraternity, the rights of the people, liberty, land to the people, bread, and more have been revolutionary slogans which have led to the denial of precisely their affirmations. In the 1790s, quote, the two great weapons of the modern state, end quote, conscription, born in France, and the income tax, made in Britain, were created. In the Ancien Régime, the state's claim to total power were still in embryonic form and in trifling ways of etiquette. Thus, when Louis XIV's meals passed by in the hall of Versailles, it was customary to raise one's hat to salute and sweep the ground with its feathers. After the French Revolution, the totalitarianism was more substantial. The state began to make itself coterminous with society, which meant controlling or suppressing all other powers and governments in society. The roots of this went back to the 13th century, when final decisions concerning social objectives began to be made by civil governments. The church was held to be increasingly, quote, merely a private society with no public powers or duties, end quote. Leadership had passed from the church to the state. The goal of the state is the old pagan and Platonic dream of a monopoly of power. By its claim to sovereignty and to universal jurisdiction over everything within its domain, the modern state seeks indeed to be a god walking on earth. The biblical faith in a multiplicity of governments under God is denied. The self-government of the individual and the governments of the family, church, school, vocation, and society are all subverted in favour of the unitary power of the state. Let us consider again Strayer's comments, quote, a state exists chiefly in the hearts and minds of its people. If they do not believe it is there, no logical exercise will bring it to life. End quote. The modern state is faltering badly. In the United States, it is said that the percentage of eligible voters who vote has been dropping in presidential elections since Woodrow Wilson's day. The modern state is, quote, a god that failed, end quote. When Christians again see the total crown rights of Christ the King, the threat of the state will collapse.